The morning air in Savannah carried the earthy scent of dew-drenched soil and the faint, comforting aroma of baked bread from the cafe 2 streets over. Vendors had begun setting up their stalls at the farmers' market just off Liberty Street, unfolding tables, arranging produce, and calling out greetings to each other. The hum of life in this quiet southern city was slow, deliberate, and familiar. Maggie Carter, 70 years old and a lifetime resident of Savannah, pushed her cart filled with bundles of collard greens, carrots, and freshly picked tomatoes across the intersection. The wheels creaked under the weight, and the basket tilted slightly as she maneuvered the cracked pavement. She wore a faded floral dress, a sun hat, and a knitted cardigan with frayed cuffs. On her wrist, a silver bracelet caught the sunlight. It was old, a little tarnished, but carefully polished every Sunday evening. Her fingers, curled from arthritis, gripped the cart handle tightly. As she neared the edge of the crosswalk, a black Mercedes came barreling around the corner, tires screeching. The car jerked to a halt just inches from Maggie. The sudden motion startled her. She stumbled backward, lost her grip, and the cart tipped over. Vegetables spilled onto the road in a chaotic splash of green and red. The driver's door opened with a sharp click. Out stepped a man in his early 30s, dressed immaculately in a navy suit that probably cost more than Maggie's entire monthly pension. His name was Ethan Walker, CEO investor, a rising star in the tech industry. His shoes were spotless, his watch gleaming, and his expression utterly displeased. "Are you serious?" he snapped, striding toward her. "You just walk into the street like that? Do you even look before crossing?" Maggie blinked, disoriented, then bent down, beginning to gather the vegetables with trembling hands. I'm sorry, son," she said softly. "I didn't see. My eyes aren't what they used to be." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You scratched my car," he muttered, glancing at a faint mark on the bumper. "Do you know how much this thing costs?" She flinched at the tone, trying to pick up a rolling tomato before it reached the gutter. "Please forgive me. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I'll pay for the damage if you give me time." He let out a dry laugh. "With what? Those vegetables?" His words stung, colder than the wind that swept through the alley. Around them, the city kept moving, indifferent to their collision of worlds. But then he stopped. As she reached for a bundle of greens, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing the bracelet. It was simple, just a silver band, lightly engraved with faint floral patterns. Ethan's gaze landed on it and held. He took a small step closer. "Where did you get that?" he asked, voice low. Maggie looked up, surprised by the shift in his tone. "This." She tugged her sleeve down, almost instinctively. "It was my son's. He wore it before he disappeared. 30 years ago now." Ethan's jaw tightened. His heart skipped a beat. "Disappeared." She nodded, her eyes suddenly misty. "There was a fire. An apartment complex, a terrible one. We lived on the 2nd floor. I tried to get him out, but the smoke, the heat. I tripped and he slipped from my arms. I never found him. Only this bracelet, near the stairs." The silence between them grew heavy. He looked again at her face, wrinkled, sun-marked, weary, but there was something there. A trace. A memory? No. An impression. And the bracelet. That bracelet. Ethan's hand moved almost involuntarily toward his chest. Later that day, when he returned to his high-rise apartment in Manhattan, he unlocked a drawer in his study. Inside, in a velvet-lined box, lay a silver bracelet, almost identical in design to the one the old woman had worn. He had no idea where it came from. All he'd been told, growing up, was that he had been adopted from a local shelter. His adoptive parents rarely spoke of it, except to say it had been a closed adoption. No details. No names. The bracelet was the only item from his past life they'd allowed him to keep. He stared at it now. Then pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photo he had taken earlier, of Maggie, kneeling on the ground, holding the other bracelet. They were identical. Same pattern. Same wear on the edges. Same small dent near the clasp. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. No. Coincidence. It had to be. And yet. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman's eyes. The way her hand trembled. The way she said "my son," with a kind of brokenness that could not be faked. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, not with accusation, but with something terrifyingly close to hope. Something about it pulled at a part of him he hadn't known was there. He couldn't sleep that night. At 3 a.m, he made himself coffee, paced the apartment, then sat down and typed Savannah apartment fire 1995 into the search bar. Headlines popped up. Historic fire destroys housing block. Several families displaced. One child reported missing, presumed dead. Mother hospitalized with burns and smoke inhalation. Name, Margaret Carter. He stared at the screen, a cold shiver crawling up his spine. It wasn't just a story. It was her story. And somehow, it was starting to feel like his too. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and packed a bag. He didn't know what he was going back for. Truth? Closure? Or something far more complicated? The flight back to Savannah was quiet. Ethan sat by the window, watching the clouds drift beneath him. The further he traveled from New York, the more uncertain he felt, not about his schedule or his business obligations, but about the gnawing feeling in his chest that had followed him since the moment he saw that silver bracelet. He wasn't the kind of man who made decisions based on emotions. He was built for data, logic, measurable outcomes. But there was something about Margaret Carter, Maggie, that had unsettled him in a way nothing else ever had. Back in Savannah, Maggie was rinsing greens in a plastic tub outside her small wooden house. It sat on a quiet street, not far from where the fire had happened all those years ago. The paint had faded, and the roof tiles were chipped, but the home held onto a kind of stubborn dignity, like its owner. She heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path and looked up, blinking against the sunlight. For a moment, her expression was confused, then surprised. Then it softened. "You came back," she said, drying her hands on her apron. "I did," Ethan replied, stopping a few steps away. "Do you have a minute?" Maggie nodded and led him to the porch. They sat in 2 wicker chairs with frayed cushions. Between them, a small table held a ceramic teapot and 2 mismatched cups. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said," Ethan began. "About the fire. About your son." Maggie didn't interrupt. She watched him with quiet patience, her hands folded in her lap. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the bracelet, the one he had kept since childhood. He set it on the table next to her cup. She stared at it. Then slowly, she reached into her cardigan sleeve and pulled her own bracelet into view. They were nearly identical. The same floral engraving. The same dented clasp. "I've had this since I was a kid," Ethan said. "My adoptive parents said it was all I had with me when I was found." Maggie picked up his bracelet with trembling fingers. Her eyes welled with tears. She didn't speak for several seconds. "I had these made when my son turned 3, she whispered. "One for him. One for me. So no matter what happened, we'd always have a piece of each other." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "Do you remember anything?" she asked softly. "Anything about that day?" He closed his eyes. Flames. Screaming. Someone calling my name. A hand, letting go. His voice faltered. He looked down, surprised at the emotion creeping into his throat. Maggie was crying now, quietly, her shoulders trembling. "I've looked for you for 30 years, she said. I've prayed. Every day. I never stopped believing." Ethan swallowed hard. The logical part of him screamed for restraint. Caution. Facts. "I've scheduled a DNA test," he said. "It should give us an answer. I needed to know if it was even possible." Maggie nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I don't want to believe something just because I'm desperate," Ethan continued. "But the bracelets, the timeline, the fire, it's too much to ignore." "I understand," she said. "I don't want to force anything. If it turns out, if it's not you, I'll still be grateful for these few moments." Ethan was stunned by her grace.
No demands. No expectations.
Just that steady warmth he'd felt since the first time she looked at him. They spent the afternoon talking. Maggie brought out photo albums, yellowed newspaper clippings, a few baby pictures of her son, James. In one, he wore the bracelet and clutched a small stuffed elephant. Ethan froze when he saw it. "That elephant," he said. "I used to have one just like it. I used to sleep with it every night." Maggie's hands covered her mouth. Later, she showed him the room that had been James's. Though repurposed as a storage space, the walls still bore faded drawings, scribbles of a sun, a house, stick figures. Ethan traced one with his finger. "I used to draw like this," he said. That night, he stayed at a local hotel near the riverfront. He couldn't sleep. He kept looking at the bracelet on the nightstand, then at the photo of the child. The more he looked, the harder it became to separate coincidence from possibility. He thought about his own childhood, or rather, the absence of it. His earliest memory was waking up in a group home. There had been no transition, no explanation. Just sudden disconnection. His adoptive parents had provided everything: education, money, stability, but never affection. Never roots. Was that because they'd always known? The next morning, Ethan and Maggie drove together to the clinic where the DNA test had been scheduled. The nurse took samples with quiet efficiency: swabs, paperwork, signatures. Results would take a few days. They sat in the car afterward, neither speaking. "I don't want to get your hopes up," Ethan said finally. Maggie looked at him, her expression calm. "I lived through 30 years of not knowing. I've survived worse than uncertainty." Ethan turned the keys, and they drove back in silence. Over the next few days, Ethan returned to Maggie's house often. They talked more. Cooked simple meals. She taught him how to make cornbread from scratch. He repaired a broken cabinet door in her kitchen. She showed him a tree in the backyard she had planted the year James was born. "I used to imagine he'd come back and climb it," she said. "It's silly, I know." "It's not silly," Ethan said. "It's love." And each day, the line between what he thought he knew and what he was starting to feel blurred a little more. He wasn't ready to call her mom. Not yet. But he was starting to understand what it might feel like. At night, he walked along the Savannah River, watching the lights shimmer on the water, replaying every word, every memory, every possibility. He was bracing himself for the answer. Because whether it was yes or no, something in him had already changed. The third day after the DNA samples were submitted, the rain arrived in Savannah. It wasn't heavy, but steady enough to wash the dust off the sidewalks and bring out the scent of wet magnolia and earth. Ethan sat by the window in the modest cafe across from the clinic, watching people pass by beneath umbrellas, tapping his fingers against a ceramic mug of untouched coffee. The results were due that afternoon. He had told himself he would wait to read them with a clear head, perhaps even with Maggie present. But the truth was, he was afraid. Not of finding out she wasn't his mother, but of what it would mean if she was. He had spent years cultivating a version of himself built on logic, control, ambition. A man unshaken by emotion or personal entanglements. A man who could lose himself in work and never look back. Now, in the span of 3 days, that version of himself was crumbling. All because of an old woman with kind eyes and a silver bracelet. His phone buzzed. The notification was brief. "Your DNA results are ready." He stared at the screen. Then, instead of opening the link, he slid the phone into his jacket and stood up. He found Maggie on her back porch, sitting in a rocking chair with a blanket across her knees and a book in her lap. The rain tapped softly on the tin roof above them. She looked up as he approached, her face unreadable for a moment, then quietly welcoming. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "I might be about to," he replied. He pulled out the phone, opened the email, and handed it to her. Maggie hesitated, then adjusted her glasses and began to read. A moment passed. Then another. She lowered the phone, eyes wet. "No match," she said softly. Ethan didn't move. He had expected it. Half expected it, at least. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the word spelled out so clinically, still struck him like a blow to the chest. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. Maggie reached out and placed her hand over his. "Don't be," she whispered. "You gave me something I haven't felt in decades. Hope." He looked at her, unsure what to say. The ache in his chest deepened. "But I was wrong," she continued. "It wasn't right of me to hope so much. To think, just because you reminded me of him, that it must be true." Ethan pulled his hand back, suddenly restless. "I shouldn't have come," he muttered, standing. "This was a mistake." "Ethan," she said, but he was already walking down the steps, into the soft drizzle. He didn't look back. He drove for hours, with no destination in mind, letting the rain blur the world outside the windshield. He thought of his childhood, of the void he had never tried to fill. Of the adoptive parents who provided but never connected. Of the child-sized silence that had always lingered at the edge of his memories. That night, back in his hotel room, he found the bracelet again. He placed it on the nightstand next to the printed DNA report, and for a long time, just stared at both. The next morning, something inside him shifted. He went back to the records.
Et ça je te dis peur.
Savannah Public Library's archives held old microfilm reels from local newspapers. Ethan spent hours scrolling through blurry headlines and faded photos. The fire at the old Rosewood housing complex had been a major tragedy. Several families displaced.
One child missing, James Carter.
A few articles mentioned a woman hospitalized with smoke inhalation, Margaret Carter. But there were other names too. Other victims.
Other children.
One article mentioned 2 unidentified toddlers found in the chaos, both without accompanying adults. One was eventually claimed. The other was placed in a local shelter and later adopted. Ethan froze.
2 children.
2. He leaned in, heart pounding. But the names were missing. Redacted, possibly, for privacy reasons. Still, the date matched. The location. The age range. He took a photo of the article and emailed it to the local shelter, Harmony House, where he had briefly stayed before adoption. He requested access to his intake records under his current legal identity. A day later, he received a reply. The woman on the phone, Helen Ruiz, was in her late 60s, and had worked at Harmony House for over 30 years. "I remember you," she said.
You were a keyboy.
"Came to us with a silver bracelet and no name. Do you know how I got there?" Ethan asked. There was a pause. "Honestly, it was chaos," she said. "That week, we took in several displaced children. One of the staff mentioned a firefighter bringing you in, said you were found alone near the fire scene." "Was there a mix-up?" he asked.
Another child.
"Possibly," Helen replied. "But the records are vague. Too vague. Looking back, I wouldn't be surprised if names were switched. We were overwhelmed."
Ethan up, feeling a sick swirl of confusion.
If records were altered, if there was another child, could Maggie's son have been that other boy? Could he be out there somewhere, alive, with no idea who he really was? And what about himself? If Maggie wasn't his biological mother, and his adoptive parents had no information, then who was? The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan returned to Maggie's porch, unsure if he'd be welcome. She opened the door before he knocked. "You're soaked," she said.
Come inside.
He stepped into the warmth of her kitchen, the familiar scent of lavender and old books greeting him like a memory that had never been his. "I found something," he said, handing her a printed copy of the article. There were 2 boys. That night. One was never identified. Maggie read slowly, lips parting in quiet disbelief. "So you may not be James," she murmured. "But someone else is," Ethan said. "And he might be out there, thinking his mother is dead." Maggie's hands trembled as she held the page. "I've lived for 3 decades believing I'd lost him," she said. "Now you're telling me he might be alive?" Ethan nodded. "And I want to help you find him." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from sorrow. "Why?" she asked. "Because you looked at me like I mattered," he said. "Not because of what I had. Not because of who I became.
Just because he existed."
Maggie reached for his hand. "You do matter," she said. "No matter whose blood runs in your veins." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan felt the air clear.
Not of doux.
Not of pain, but of purpose. 2 days after Ethan's return to Maggie's porch, the sun broke through the Savannah clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks. The street steamed under its warmth, and a breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the open windows of Maggie's modest kitchen. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open beside a notepad filled with scribbled names and half-legible addresses. Maggie, still in her morning robe, stirred a pot of grits on the stove, the wooden spoon moving in lazy circles. Neither of them spoke much that morning. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, it was familiar, even comforting. Since the discovery that there had been another unidentified child at the fire, Maggie had seemed to carry a kind of quiet energy, something like cautious hope. Ethan, meanwhile, had thrown himself into searching records, calling old shelters, tracking down the names of staff who might remember anything at all from 30 years ago.
Any news?
Maggie asked gently, breaking the silence as she brought 2 bowls to the table.
Not yet, Ethan said, rubbing his eyes.
I've sent emails to 3 more former shelter workers. One of them replied. Said he'd be willing to talk over the phone later today. But no one remembers a definitive second boy. Maggie sat down across from him, her hands curling around the warmth of her bowl. I still can't believe this might be possible. For so long, I thought he was gone. Then you appeared, and for a moment.
Il est mes elfes belièvent. Ethan meilleur eyes.
You weren't wrong to hope. I was in a way, she said, her voice calm. But hope is a strange thing. Even when it's based on nothing, it keeps you going. They ate in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. After breakfast, Ethan stood and walked to the living room, where Maggie kept a small bookshelf filled with photo albums and boxes of memories. He had leafed through most of them already, searching for any detail that might help him recognize something, anything from a childhood he didn't remember. But that morning, something new caught his eye. A small envelope, yellowed with age, wedged between 2 albums. He pulled it out. The handwriting on the front was faded, but legible. To my son, James. In case you ever come home. He turned it over. It had never been opened. Maggie, he called softly. She came in slowly, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes fell on the envelope in his hands, and she paused. I wrote that a year after the fire, she said. I didn't know where to send it, so I just kept it. May I? Ethan asked. She nodded. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, the creases worn soft with time. He unfolded it and read aloud. James. If somehow you survived and you're out there, I want you to know something. You were not abandoned. I never stopped looking. Every day, I search for you. Every night, I pray that you're warm, that you're safe, that someone is holding your hand when I cannot. You are loved. Always. No matter where you are. No matter who you become. Love. Mom. Ethan finished reading and sat down slowly. He placed the letter back on the table with a reverence he didn't fully understand. She meant every word of that, he said quietly. Maggie didn't respond at first. She walked to the window, looking out over her small garden. The flowers were blooming now, bright against the backdrop of weathered fence posts and old pavers. I don't know if he'll ever read that letter, she said, her back to him. But knowing you read it, it feels like it still reached someone. Ethan stood and joined her at the window. Whether I'm him or not, it reached me. That afternoon, Ethan made the scheduled call to the former shelter worker, a man named Charles Bell, now living in Raleigh, North Carolina. Charles had worked as a night supervisor at Harmony House during the mid-90s. I remember that fire, Charles said after a pause. So many children displaced that year. We didn't have enough space. Some kids were moved within hours. Do you remember a boy with a silver bracelet? Ethan asked. A longer pause. Actually, yes, Charles said slowly. 2 boys came in around the same time. One had a bracelet. The other didn't. No names, no records. Just terrified kids. Ethan's heart pounded. Do you remember what happened to the second boy? I think he was transferred, Charles said. To a temporary home upstate. Then, nothing. We lost track. Back then, it wasn't all digitized. Things got missed. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of thoughts in his mind. Do you remember what he looked like? He asked. Not really, Charles admitted. Too long ago. But I remember thinking, they might have been brothers. Or at least, they looked close enough to be. When the call ended, Ethan sat on the porch for a long time. Maggie brought him a glass of iced tea and sat beside him, not asking for an update. He told her anyway. There was another boy, he said. And he might have looked like me. Maggie inhaled slowly. I want to find him, Ethan added. If there's a chance he's your son, I want to help. Maggie smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his. Why? He thought for a moment before answering. Because when I thought I might be your son, he said, it gave me something I didn't know I needed. And I think he deserves that chance too. They watched the sun sink low over the rooftops, casting gold across the horizon. That night, Ethan called a private investigator he trusted from his corporate dealings in New York. He didn't explain everything, just said he was looking for a man adopted from the Savannah area in 1995, around the age of 3, possibly with no recorded birth name. He wired the retainer fee and sent over all the notes he had. He knew it might take weeks, months. Maybe nothing would come of it at all. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt committed to something beyond work, beyond performance. He wasn't chasing profit or legacy. He was chasing truth. For Maggie. For James. And maybe for himself. Later that night, as he lay on the small guest bed in Maggie's home, he opened the letter one more time. He read it silently, then placed it beneath his pillow. He didn't know if he was the son that letter was meant for. But it still made him feel like someone's child. A week passed. In that time, Ethan developed a rhythm that surprised him. Each morning, he rose with the sun, helped Maggie water her garden, then sat on the porch with coffee and his laptop, reaching out to anyone who might help piece together the mystery of the missing boy. He still returned emails from his company in New York and joined the occasional video call, but his priorities had shifted. The city that had once made him feel restless now offered something different: stillness, purpose, and in Maggie's quiet presence, a sense of home he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Despite their growing connection, both Ethan and Maggie remained quietly guarded about one thing: the DNA test. It had come and gone, its results conclusive. No match. But neither of them spoke of it directly anymore. It sat between them like a closed door, one that Ethan had walked through and Maggie had quietly accepted, even as the light dimmed slightly in her eyes. On the 8th day, Maggie was sweeping the front porch when Ethan returned from the post office, holding a small, official-looking envelope. He didn't have to say anything. She saw it in his expression. "The hard copy," she said, straightening up and brushing her hands on her apron. He nodded. "Came in this morning." They went inside. He placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it. "You don't have to read it again," Maggie said gently. "We already know what it says." "I know," Ethan replied. "But something about having it in my hands makes it feel more real." He sat down and opened the envelope slowly, carefully pulling out the paper inside. His eyes scanned the document: clean formatting, medical jargon, percentages. Confirmed non-match. He folded the paper and set it aside. "I don't know why I thought it would feel different seeing it on paper," he said. "But it doesn't." Maggie took the seat across from him. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. I don't want you to feel trapped by something that was never yours to carry." Ethan looked at her, genuinely struck by her words. "But I do owe you something. Even if we're not related. You gave me something I didn't know I needed." "What's that?" "A reason to question everything I thought I understood about family." Maggie smiled, though her eyes remained damp. "I don't regret it, you know. Believing for a little while that you were mine." "Me neither," he said. The room was quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Outside, a bird chirped from the edge of the garden. "I think I know why I came back," Ethan said after a moment. "Even before the DNA results. Even before the fire records and the bracelet. I think I was looking for someone who'd see me." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "See you?" Not the job title, not the polished exterior. Just me. And somehow you did. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. "I saw someone who was searching for something, even if you didn't know it yet." He nodded, feeling a weight lift, not because the truth was clear, but because something deeper had become undeniable. Whatever they were to each other, it mattered. Later that afternoon, Maggie pulled out a shoebox she kept in her bedroom closet. Inside were pieces of James's life, photographs, drawings, the birth certificate that had faded over time, and a few birthday cards she had written but never sent. She placed the box on the table and opened it for Ethan. "These are the things I held on to," she said. "Just in case. I'd almost stopped looking at them. But maybe it's time to revisit some of it." Ethan sifted through the contents slowly. A crayon drawing of a house. A stick figure labeled Mom. A photo of a toddler in overalls, holding a balloon. A birthday card that read, to my sweet boy, wherever you are, Mom loves you." He ran his fingers along the edge of the card. "This is all he ever had of you," he said. "And it's so much more than most people get." Maggie folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder what he looks like now. Whether he smiles like he used to. If he ever thinks about the woman who held him that night and never let go, even when the smoke made it impossible to breathe." Ethan looked up. "I think he does. Somewhere, even if he doesn't understand why, he remembers." They sat in silence, letting the years between them settle. That evening, they ate dinner on the porch. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the air was warm with the scent of jasmine. Ethan had barely touched his food. Something sat heavy in his chest, more than the results, more than the search. It was a question he hadn't asked yet, one he'd been afraid of. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." If we don't find James, if we never do, what then?" Maggie looked at him for a long moment, then placed her fork down carefully. "Then we keep living," she said. "We find ways to love the people who are here. We tell the truth. We remember. And we don't close the door on miracles, but we don't wait for them to live our lives." He nodded slowly, swallowing past the tightness in his throat. "Do you think we could still be something?" he asked, almost whispering. "I think we already are," she replied. "Whatever name we give it, mother, son, friend, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's real." He looked out over the yard. Fireflies had begun to appear, blinking in and out of the tall grass. Somewhere down the street, a wind chime rang softly. That night, Ethan didn't sleep in the guest room. Instead, he pulled a blanket out to the porch and lay on the wicker bench, the stars overhead watching silently. He held the letter Maggie had once written to James and the photograph of the boy with the balloon. He thought of his own childhood, how little he remembered, how much had been lost between systems and silence. But here, in this quiet corner of Savannah, something had been found. Not DNA. Not certainty. But something gentler. Belonging. The following morning, Ethan awoke to the faint clinking of dishes and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. The light outside was soft, filtered through the porch screens and the tall oak trees that lined the street. For a moment he stayed still, staring at the wood-paneled ceiling, letting the unfamiliar sensation of peace settle into his chest. He rose, stretched, and stepped quietly into the kitchen, where Maggie was already setting the table with toast, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. She smiled when she saw him. "Didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't," he replied. "I've slept better here than I have in years." They ate together, exchanging easy conversation about the garden, the neighbors, and the strange number of cats that had begun showing up on her back porch. But beneath the surface, Ethan could feel a new kind of tension rising, something unsettled within him. Later that afternoon, after Maggie had gone to visit a friend across town, Ethan took a call he'd been putting off. He walked out to the backyard, phone in hand, and pressed dial. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ethan, everything okay?" His adoptive father, Richard Walker, sounded more concerned than usual. Not warm but measured, as always. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said. "About something important." A pause. "All right," Richard replied.
I'm listening.
"I've been in Savannah," Ethan said. "There's someone I met here. A woman named Margaret Carter." Silence on the line. "She thought I might be her son. From a fire that happened in 1995. The Rosewood Complex fire." More silence. "I ran a DNA test," Ethan continued. "We're not related. But I've been doing some digging. And I found something strange." Still, Richard didn't speak. There were 2 boys found at the fire. No names. One was adopted quickly. The other disappeared into the system. And the records, they don't match what I've been told. Richard exhaled audibly. "What exactly are you asking me?" "I want to know where I really came from," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Not the story you told me. The truth." When his father finally spoke again, his tone had shifted. It was cautious. Heavier. "Your mother and I were told about a boy at Harmony House. He'd been found near the fire, no ID, no parents. They said there was a window to adopt him, but it had to be fast. Discretion was expected." You knew it was connected to the fire? We had our suspicions, Richard admitted. But they made it sound clean, legal. You were healthy, bright. The paperwork was in order. And we were tired, Ethan. We'd been trying for years to adopt. You were there, and we were told that if we hesitated, you might be gone. Ethan felt his grip tighten on the phone. So you looked the other way. It wasn't that simple. Yes, it was, Ethan snapped. You chose not to ask questions. You chose silence. Richard sighed. We raised you well. We gave you everything. You gave me a house and a name, Ethan said. But you never gave me answers. You never asked. I didn't know what to ask. There was a long pause. Ethan heard the sound of a distant television in the background, muffled voices rising and falling. You're angry, Richard said finally. I'm not just angry, Ethan said. I'm lost. You found your way before. Because I had to, Ethan said. But now I have the chance to know who I really am. And I won't let comfort or convenience stop me. Richard didn't argue. He only said, I hope you find what you're looking for. Ethan ended the call without saying goodbye. He stood in the backyard for a long time, staring up at the sky, watching as a few clouds drifted lazily across the blue. That evening, when Maggie returned, she found him on the back porch, the phone sitting next to a glass of untouched iced tea. You okay? She asked. I talked to my father, he said. She sat down beside him. He admitted they knew. That the adoption was rushed, maybe even shady. They knew I was probably connected to the fire, but they didn't care. Maggie's hands folded quietly in her lap. He said they gave me a good life. That I shouldn't look back. Do you believe that? She asked. I don't know, Ethan said. I don't think I'd be who I am without them. But I also don't think I'd feel this, empty if they just told me the truth. Maggie nodded slowly. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. He looked at her. Do you think James would want to know? If he's out there, if he's been living his life under a different name, maybe with different parents, would he want someone like me showing up and telling him his entire past was a lie? I can't answer that, she said. But I know that I would want to know. If it were me, I'd want someone to knock on my door and tell me the truth, no matter how painful. Ethan leaned back, his head against the wooden beam behind him. I think I want to keep going, he said. Keep looking. Not just for him, but for me too. Because this story, it's mine now, whether I like it or not. I'm with you, Maggie said quietly. He turned to her, surprised. Even if it leads nowhere? She smiled. Especially then. Because sometimes, searching is the only way we know we're still alive. They sat there together, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. The porch lights flicked on automatically as the sky dimmed into dusk. Maggie stood after a while and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Tomorrow we start fresh, she said. We look where we haven't looked. We ask again. We knock on every door. Ethan nodded. He didn't know if he would ever find James. He didn't even know what finding him would mean. But the truth was no longer optional. It had become the thing he owed, not just to Maggie, not just to the boy who had vanished, but to the man he was finally becoming. That night, he wrote an email to the private investigator he'd hired, detailing everything he now knew about the rushed adoption, the second boy, and the possible paper trail. He attached the article clippings, the names of former shelter workers, and a photo of the bracelet. Then he sent a message to Richard Walker. Thank you for raising me. But from here on, I need to raise myself. He turned off his phone and stared out the window. Tomorrow would be another day in the search. Another step into the unknown. But at least now, he was facing it with his eyes open. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. The sky outside was still gray, the world caught between night and dawn. He sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at the closed laptop on the desk across from him. Inside it were all the names, files, and conversations he had gathered so far, threads of a story only partially told. By the time Maggie entered the kitchen, Ethan already had coffee brewed and toast buttered. She raised an eyebrow in mock suspicion. You're up early, she said, reaching for a mug. Didn't sleep much, Ethan replied. Too many pieces, not enough answers. She joined him at the table. The quiet between them was warm, comfortable. But he could see the same weight in her posture, the same patience worn thin by decades of unanswered prayers. "I think I have something," Ethan said. "Or at least, the beginning of something." He pulled out a folder from his bag and opened it between them. Inside were printouts from the investigator he'd hired, reports, summaries, and a scanned image of an old intake form from Harmony House. One of the boys brought in after the fire, listed only as Child B, was never properly registered. No photo, no name, just a brief note that he was transferred to a private foster facility within 48 hours. Maggie leaned in, squinting at the document. Transferred where? That's the problem. The place he was sent to doesn't exist anymore. It was a temporary holding home in northern Georgia. No digital records. The files were supposedly destroyed when the center closed down in the early 2000s. Maggie sighed. And the trail ends there? Not exactly, Ethan said. The investigator found a former employee from that center. A woman named Denise Parker. She's in her 60s now. Lives in a retirement community near Augusta. She agreed to meet us. Maggie looked at him, hopeful but guarded. When? Today. If you're up for a drive. They left after breakfast. The road from Savannah to Augusta stretched long and flat through the Georgia countryside, dotted with pine trees, old barns, and faded billboards. Neither spoke much during the first hour. The silence was necessary, a buffer between the past they were chasing and the reality they might find. About halfway through the drive, Maggie broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "what your life might have looked like if things had been different? If your adoption hadn't been rushed? If someone had told the truth from the start?" "All the time," Ethan said. "But then I think, would I have become the same person? Would I have had the same drive? The same questions? And would you have come back to Savannah?" He smiled faintly. "Probably not. I wouldn't have known there was a reason to." By mid-morning, they pulled into the parking lot of a modest retirement community, white buildings with tidy flower beds and a slow, peaceful energy. Inside, a staff member directed them to a small common room where Denise Parker was waiting. She was a petite woman with short gray hair and alert eyes. She rose slowly from her seat as they approached. "You must be Ethan," she said, shaking his hand. "And this must be Mrs. Carter." "Thank you for meeting with us," Ethan said. "I was surprised by your message," Denise admitted, motioning for them to sit. "It's been years since I thought about that fire. But when you mentioned a boy with no records, it came back to me." Maggie sat forward. "Do you remember what he looked like?" "Only vaguely," Denise said. "He was small, quiet. Clung to a blanket for days. Wouldn't speak. He was only there for about a week before a private agency picked him up." Ethan frowned. "Private agency?" "Yes. That's what struck me as odd," she continued. "Normally, adoptions took months. But with him, the process was almost instant. A well-dressed couple arrived, said they had the proper documentation, and took him home." "Do you remember their names?" "I don't," Denise admitted. "But I remember the man had a ring on his pinky finger, a thick silver band with a family crest. Looked like old money." Maggie's breath caught. Was the boy wearing anything when he arrived? Anything memorable? Denise thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. A hospital bracelet, I think. But it had no name, just the date. I also remember a small stuffed animal. A blue rabbit." Maggie gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. "He had that when he was a baby," she whispered. "A gift from his father. He never went anywhere without it." Ethan leaned forward. "Do you think there's any chance we could trace the agency that handled the adoption?" "It would be a long shot," Denise said. "But I'll dig through what little paperwork I kept. Some of us held on to things. Just in case." They thanked her and left with a renewed sense of urgency. Back in the car, Maggie clutched Ethan's hand. "That was him," she said. "I know it." "I think so too," Ethan replied. "Now we just have to prove it." That evening, back in Savannah, Ethan emailed the investigator with everything Denise had shared. He also made a note to research old private adoption agencies operating in northern Georgia in 1995. He sat at the table long after Maggie went to bed, piecing together timelines, building profiles, writing down every detail he could remember. Then he paused.
The silver ring. The family crest.
A memory flickered, something from his childhood. Not a clear image, but a sensation. A large hand with a heavy ring resting on his shoulder. A cold voice telling him to be quiet. He didn't know if it was real or imagined. But it gave him a direction. He wrote one final note before shutting his laptop.
Private agency. Blue rabbit. Silver ring.
The pieces were no longer scattered. They were starting to align. And for the first time since he met Maggie, Ethan felt something more than hope. He felt momentum.
The story wasn't over.
Not yet. 3 days later, Ethan received a call just after breakfast. The private investigator, Sam Delaney, sounded alert, his voice tight with something between caution and excitement. "I think we've got him," Sam said. "The boy who was taken from the foster home in 1995. His name is Daniel Hayes now. He was adopted by a couple from Atlanta, Walter and Lillian Hayes. Wealthy.
All Southern money."
Walter wore a silver ring with a family crest, which matches what the woman at the retirement home described. Ethan's heart jumped. He stepped outside onto the porch, letting the door swing shut behind him. "Does Daniel know anything?" he asked. "Not yet," Sam replied. "I've reached out discreetly." Gave him the basic idea, that we're looking into adoption records from the mid-90s. He agreed to meet, but he doesn't know who's asking. He's based in Charlotte now. Works in finance. Mid-30s. Married.
No children.
Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "You're sure it's him?" "As sure as we can be without a DNA test," Sam said. "All the details line up." After the call, Ethan sat on the porch for a long time, thinking. The morning air was warm, but his hands felt cold. When Maggie came out to join him with 2 mugs of coffee, she noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "You found him," she said, not as a question. "I think so," Ethan replied, staring out toward the garden. "His name is Daniel now. He lives in Charlotte. Married.
Stable life."
Sam reached out, he agreed to meet. But he doesn't know who he's meeting. Maggie didn't speak right away. She sat beside him, wrapping her fingers around her mug. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she said finally. "Hope? Fear? Guilt?" "You don't owe anyone guilt," Ethan said. "I left him," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. But I let go." "You were trying to save him." "I failed." Ethan turned to face her. "You didn't fail. You survived. And you searched. You never stopped." She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Will you go?" "Yes," he said. "But I don't think I should go alone." They arrived in Charlotte the next afternoon.
The city was slick with spring rain, the sidewalks shining beneath the street lamp.
Ethan had arranged the meeting at a quiet cafe tucked between a bookstore and a wine bar in the historic district. Daniel arrived 5 minutes early. Ethan recognized him instantly. The resemblance was there, faint, but undeniable. The same high cheekbones. The same slope to the nose. His eyes were sharper, more guarded, but the way he scanned the room reminded Ethan of himself. Daniel approached the table cautiously. He wore a tailored jacket, no tie, and an expression of polite confusion. "You must be Ethan," he said, shaking his hand. "Sam said you were looking into adoption records. Can I ask what this is about?" Ethan hesitated for a second, then motioned to the woman sitting beside him. "This is Margaret Carter," he said. 30 years ago, she lost her son in a fire. We believe you might be him."
Daniel blinked.
"Once. Then again. What?" Ethan opened the folder on the table. Inside were photos, records, timelines, everything he and Maggie had gathered. He pushed it gently toward Daniel. "We know you were adopted from a foster system in Georgia, 1995. We know your adoption was processed through a private agency, quickly, without clear documentation. And we know you were found near the site of the Rosewood Complex fire, just like Maggie's son." Daniel didn't touch the folder. He leaned back in his chair, clearly stunned. "I've always known I was adopted," he said after a long pause. "But my parents never gave me details. They said it didn't matter." That I was chosen. Maggie spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. When you were little, you had a blue stuffed rabbit.
Doyu remember?
Daniel looked at her, blinking. I think I did, he said. My mom used to say I wouldn't go anywhere without it. It's in an old photo album somewhere. I gave it to you when you were born, Maggie said. I stitched one ear when it tore. You used to chew on the left foot when you were teething. Daniel looked shaken.
Ethan leaned forward.
We're not here to force anything. But we're asking you to consider the possibility. A DNA test would confirm it. If you're willing. Daniel exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. Why now? After all this time? Because some truths wait until we're ready for them, Ethan said. And sometimes they wait too long. Daniel looked between them, at Maggie, whose hands trembled slightly in her lap, and Ethan, who had become in this strange story something like a mirror to both of them. I need time, Daniel said. This is a lot. Of course, Ethan said.
Oui, understand.
Daniel stood, then paused. She looks like the woman in my dreams. I always thought it was just a face I made up. But now. He shook his head. I'll think about the test. I just need to talk to my parents first. Maggie nodded.
Take all the time you need.
After Daniel left, Ethan and Maggie sat in silence, the weight of the moment still hanging over them. He has your eyes, Ethan said quietly. Maggie's hands were clenched together, resting on the table. I don't want to get ahead of myself. You've waited 30 years. You're allowed to hope. They drove back to Savannah the next day, exhausted in a way that wasn't physical. Neither of them spoke much on the way home. But when they pulled into the driveway and stepped into the house, Maggie paused and looked around her small, familiar kitchen. I don't know what comes next, she said. We wait, Ethan replied. And while we wait, we live. That night, Maggie pulled out a small photo frame from a box in the closet. Inside was a picture of James at 3 years old, wearing overalls and holding a blue rabbit. She placed it on the windowsill, beside a candle she lit in silence. Ethan stood behind her, watching. He came, she said. Maybe not all the way, but he came. Because you never stopped believing. And for the first time in 30 years, Maggie let herself smile without reservation. Hope was no longer a memory. It was walking, breathing, and had just looked her in the eyes. The sun had barely risen when Ethan's phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a simple message from an unknown number. He opened it with a cautious heart, already suspecting what it might be.
This is Daniel.
I've scheduled the DNA test. Results in a few days. Just thought you should know. Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. It was short, almost detached. But beneath its brevity, it carried the full weight of everything they'd been working toward. He slipped out of bed and walked to the porch where the morning air was still cool. The quiet hum of early birdsong filled the space around him. The world felt suspended, like it was holding its breath. Maggie joined him an hour later, a cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes met his, and without a word, he handed her the phone. She read the message slowly, then handed it back. Are you scared? She asked. I don't even know what to be scared of anymore, Ethan replied. I think I'm afraid that even if it's a match, everything might still feel uncertain. Maggie nodded. That's the thing no one tells you about closure. It doesn't come with a ribbon on top. It comes with more questions. They sat together in silence. In those quiet hours before the town awoke, the air between them held a fragile balance, between fear and hope, grief and anticipation. 2 days later, Daniel called. His voice on the line was steady, but distant. I got the results, he said. Ethan stood still in the middle of Maggie's kitchen. Maggie watched him closely, reading his every breath. And? Ethan asked. A pause. It's a match, Daniel said.
She's my mother.
Ethan didn't speak right away. The words sat too heavily in the air. Daniel cleared his throat. They confirmed it. 99.9%. There's no doubt. Ethan's knees buckled slightly, and he leaned against the counter. Thank you, he whispered. I don't really know what to do now, Daniel continued. My parents, well, the people who raised me, they didn't know either. They were told I was an orphan. No ties. Now, this changes everything. I understand, Ethan said. I don't think they lied to me on purpose. I think they were lied to too. That happens more than we think.
Daniel sighed. I'm not angry.
Just disoriented. Ethan hesitated before asking, would you be willing to come down? See her again?
Let her see you, knowing what you know now.
There was a long pause.
I need a little time, Daniel said.
But yes. I want to. I just need to wrap my head around who I've been, and who I might be now. After the call ended, Ethan relayed the news to Maggie, who sat down slowly at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. For several minutes, she just breathed. Then she asked a question he didn't expect. What if he doesn't come back? Ethan looked at her. He said he would. But what if he doesn't? She asked again, her voice low. What if this is too much for him?
Ethan sat beside her.
Then we still have something most people never get.
The truth.
Maggie nodded, blinking quickly. He's alive. That's already more than I ever expected. The following week was a blur of days, both long and short. Maggie continued her routines, tending to her garden, preparing meals, sitting by the window with her knitting, but Ethan could see how the weight affected her. She flinched at every phone call. She paused longer at the mailbox. She sat quietly through most meals. Ethan tried to distract her, suggesting trips into town, walks along the river, dinner at the little diner that served the best fried catfish in Georgia. Sometimes she agreed. Other times, she simply shook her head and returned to her silence. On the 9th day, a package arrived. It was addressed to Maggie. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a framed photograph, Daniel as an adult, standing beside his wife in front of a house. Attached was a note, handwritten.
Dear Margaret.
I'm not sure what to call you yet. I hope that's okay.
This is Menau.
And this is Amy, my wife. She's kind, and she's been holding me together since the moment this news came crashing down. I thought you should see me. See the life I've lived.
I'm not ready to say everything yet.
But I'm getting there.
Thank you for waiting for me.
Daniel. Maggie stared at the photo for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Then she placed it on the shelf beside the old photo of James as a toddler, holding the blue rabbit. I waited 30 years, she said. I can wait a little longer. Later that evening, Ethan sat with her on the porch. Do you regret any of this? He asked. Maggie looked out at the quiet street, where the last light of day flickered between the trees. No, she said. Even with the pain. Even with the waiting. It gave me something to hold on to.
I've never seen anyone carry hope the way you do.
It's not hope if you're sure, she replied. It's faith. And faith is what got me through. Ethan smiled, then looked down at his hands. I think you gave me some of it, he said. I didn't even know I needed it. You gave me something too, she said. A reason to keep looking. Even when I was ready to stop. He nodded. The bond between them was undeniable now, not one of blood, but of choice, of shared wounds and shared healing. That night, Ethan wrote a letter. Not an email, but a real, handwritten letter. He addressed it to Daniel. I don't know what it's like to discover your life isn't what you thought. But I do know what it feels like to lose your place in the story. If you ever need someone to walk through this with you, not as your brother, not as your rival, just as someone who understands, I'll be here. She's waited a long time.
And so have you. Take your time.
But don't stay away forever. He placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and left it on the table. Maggie came in a few minutes later and picked it up. She looked at him. You think he'll come? I do, Ethan said. I think he's already on his way. Just not on the road yet. The window was open.
Criquet sont outside.
The stars above Savannah shone clear and quiet, like beacons waiting for someone to find their way home. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when the knock came. Maggie was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of grits on the stove. Ethan was out in the garden, trimming back the overgrown rosemary bush that had been sprawling across the walkway. Neither of them was expecting company, so when the knock echoed through the house, it sent a quiet jolt through the stillness.
Maggie froze, wooden spoon in hand.
For a moment, she simply stared at the door, her breath caught in her throat. Then she walked over, slowly, as if each step might change what she found on the other side. She opened the door.
Daniel stood there.
He wore jeans, a button-down shirt, and a hesitant smile that tugged nervously at the corner of his mouth. In one hand, he held a small paper bag. In the other, a faded blue rabbit worn, one ear hanging by a few threads, its left foot nearly smooth from years of handling.
Maggie didn't speak. Neither did he.
They simply stood there, staring at each other as though time had folded in on itself, erasing the 3 decades that had stretched between them.
"I thought you might want this," Daniel finally said, holding up the rabbit. "I kept it. All these years. I didn't know why. I just couldn't throw it away."
Maggie reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the soft fabric. Her eyes filled, and her voice came out in a whisper.
"James." Daniel's eyes softened. "I guess I was."
Then Maggie did something Ethan had never seen her do. She reached forward and embraced him, clutching him tightly, her hands on his back, her face buried against his shoulder like she had done with him as a toddler. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. But then his arms came around her, awkward at first, then firmer. Ethan stepped in from the garden, stopping just short of the doorway when he saw them.
He didn't say a word. He didn't need to.
Later, they sat at the kitchen table.
The grits had gone cold. No one seemed to care.
Daniel looked around the small house, absorbing every detail. The walls were lined with family photos, some recent, some decades old. He paused at one in particular, a black and white snapshot of a woman with a baby on her hip, both smiling beneath a magnolia tree.
"That was taken the week before the fire," Maggie said quietly. "You always loved that tree. Used to chase butterflies around it."
Daniel nodded, the memory faint but suddenly alive, flickering like a light in a long-forgotten room.
"I think I remember the smell," he said. "The blossoms." They talked for hours.
Daniel told them about his childhood, his adoptive parents, the private school in Atlanta, the quiet summers spent at the lake house. He told them how he'd always felt a certain weight, a question beneath the surface of his life that he couldn't quite name.
"I used to wonder if I was missing something," he said. "But I didn't know what that meant until I saw your face."
Maggie shared her story too, not just the day of the fire, but the years after.
The guilt. The hope. The endless visits to orphanages and shelters. The letters she'd written and never sent. "I kept one for every birthday," she said, her eyes wet. 30 of them. Daniel took a deep breath, then reached for her hand. "I wish I'd known. I wish someone had told me." "You know now," she said, her voice thick. "That's what matters." Ethan stood by the window, watching them. He felt something rise in his chest, not jealousy, not sadness, but a quiet sense of peace. This was what he had come here for. This was the moment he hadn't even known he was chasing. He turned to go, but Daniel stopped him. "Hey," he said. "You're part of this too." Ethan smiled faintly. "Not by blood." "Doesn't matter," Daniel said. "You're the reason I'm here." They looked at each other, both men shaped by the same fire, the same silence, and now, the same woman who had brought them together again. That night, the 3 of them sat on the porch as the sun dipped low behind the trees. The air smelled of jasmine and warm earth. Maggie brought out a pitcher of sweet tea and 3 mismatched glasses. "You know," she said, pouring carefully, "I never imagined I'd get to sit here like this. With both of you. You're different, but I see the same light in your eyes." Neither man responded right away. Ethan took a sip of tea and looked out at the stars beginning to prick the sky. "Do you think we're meant to find our way back?" he asked. "To each other?" Daniel said. "To the truth," Ethan replied. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her eyes full of reflection. "I think we all live in circles," she said. "Sometimes we drift apart. Sometimes we lose each other. But if we're lucky, if we don't give up, those circles bring us back." The night deepened around them. Laughter drifted from a house down the street. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime whispered in the breeze. Daniel reached into the bag he'd brought with him and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this," he said. "But I figured it belonged here." He unwrapped a small, framed document, his birth certificate. The original, now recovered after a long process of legal requests. It bore the name James Carter. He handed it to Maggie. She stared at it as if it were a holy relic. Her fingers brushed the ink gently. "Welcome home, baby." No one said anything for a while after that. There was nothing left to say. In that moment, they weren't bound by biology, by circumstance, or even by the fire that had once torn them apart. They were bound by something deeper, by choice, by love, and by the courage to face the truth together. Maggie, the mother who never gave up. Ethan, the seeker who brought the story back to life. And James, Daniel, who had found his way home at last. Sometimes, the family we lose comes back to us. And sometimes, the family we build along the way becomes just as real. As the stars blinked brighter above, 3 figures sat beneath them, sipping sweet tea, surrounded by silence and the sound of hearts finally at rest.